to the CogTalk. To give you a little bit idea of what this event is, it is an interdisciplinary forum for discussions on the mind and the brain. And in today's session, we have Professor Nancy Kanwisher. I would like to say a few things about her. So she, in her lab, works on studying the relationship between the mental functions and the brain structures. So if you imagine the cognitive functions arising from different parts of the brain, and you could map them on the mind containing specific information. Similarly, they use neuroimaging to understand the correlations and causality of cognitive functions. Her group tackles the questions of the mind-brain relationship using neurobiological, psychological, as well as evolutionary perspective. This work happens at MIT, where Professor Kanwisher is a Walter Rosenblit Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and a member of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research. For her contributions to cognitive sciences, she has won awards, the Heineken Prize, an honor which is bestowed upon researchers who offer a new perspective to sciences. And she has won several other awards, a few of them including David Teller Award, Distinguished Women in Science Award, MacArthur Award, and founder. And she is the member of American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Psychonomic Society. She's also making an effort to popularize cognitive neuroscience through her Nancy's Brain Talks. You can look them up at nancybraintalks.mit.edu. And in today's lecture, she will be discussing about computational models of neural architecture and their development through experience. I would also like to introduce Professor Ramesh Mishra, who is chair at the Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences at University of Hyderabad. He is interested in studying the mechanisms of cognitive control in the mind by looking at individual differences in bilinguals, in deaf populations, as well as typical adults. He also explores the similarities and differences between conscious and unconscious process of attentional control. He is an author of several books, and the recent one is on bilingualism and cultural cognition, where he touches upon some of these issues. He is a member of the Psychonomic Society, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cultural Cognitive Science, near Springer Nature. Recently, he's working on a multi-centric Erasmus Plus program, improving the cognitive science research and education at graduate and doctoral level. Today, he's playing the role of a discussant. And finally, I am Vaishnavi Mohite. I am a PhD student at CNCS. I study how we tackle distractors using cognitive psychological theories of selective attention and using eye tracking methodology. I am the host for today's talk, and I will be taking audience questions for whoever wishes to write them down in the Q&A section. And if you wish to ask them yourselves, by the end of the talk, we will give you an opportunity and you can unmute your mics and ask your questions directly. So Professor Kanwisher suggested that if you have any clarifications during the talk about anything which you did not follow, you can write them down in the Q&A section, and I will read them out as and when you write them down so that we can continue the session without any more disturbance. And just one final announcement, this talk is getting recorded, so it will be uploaded on the official YouTube channel of University of Hyderabad for any of you who wish to look at it again or share with your friends and colleagues. So without spending much more time, I would request Professor to start with her talk.
Okay, thank you so much, Vaishnavi. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me load up my slides. Let's see here. Okay, view, presenter view. Okay. I'm new to this system of, whoops, hang on. Placing the little bar here. Okay, so are you guys seeing what looks like a title slide here and it's centered appropriately and all of that?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay, great. Good. Well, it's a delight to be here. And I'd like to start this talk by noting some good news, and that is that our field of cognitive neuroscience in humans has made a lot of progress in the last 25 years. It's given us a new picture of the organization of the human brain, shown very schematically here. And what this picture is meant to show is that there are now dozens of regions of the cortex in humans for which we have a pretty good idea of what that little patch of cortex does. And each of these functions is present in approximately the same location in pretty much every normal brain. And these functions include not just perceptual functions, like seeing color or motion, but even very high-level, abstract, uniquely human functions, like understanding language, perceiving music, and even thinking about what other people are thinking. And so I like this diagram because I think of it as kind of an initial sketch of who we are as human beings. What is the structure of the human mind here reflected in the organization of the brain? And I think that's pretty awesome and pretty fun. And it counts as real progress. But at the same time, this is just the barest beginning. Really what this diagram does is lay bare a wide array of exciting open questions. And so what I want to do today is talk about three of those questions. So first, I'll consider, what does functional selectivity even mean? What does it mean to say that a patch of the brain is specialized for face perception? Second, I'll consider whether that claim is even true. And third, I will consider, notice I say consider, not answer, consider how some of this organization arises in development. And I will address these questions in the context of the ventral visual pathway in humans, this region at the bottom of the brain, down behind your ears, where some of the strongest evidence for functional selectivity has come along and been widely replicated in many labs. That is selectivity for faces in the fusiform face area, for places in the parahippocampal cortex, and for bodies in the extrastriate body area. Okay, so in more detail, the questions I want to ask. First, what does it even mean to say that a patch of cortex responds selectively to faces or places or bodies? So my colleague, Jim DiCarlo, who's a computational neuroscientist, has been saying for years, that's just a word model. And he means that quite pejoratively. A word model is not a good thing in his view. And for a long time, I found this kind of pedantic and annoying. And I would say, Jim, you know what a face and a place and a body is. We wouldn't disagree if we decided if images had faces, places, and bodies. It's pretty straightforward. All I mean is that patch of brain responds selectively to those things. What is the problem? But after several years of this kind of being stuck there, I realized that actually he's got a point. He's onto something. And I think what he's saying is that a claim that a patch of cortex is selective for faces, places, or bodies is not a computationally explicit hypothesis. It's a word that stands, it's kind of a placeholder for an algorithm that we haven't specified, right? That algorithm is, how would a patch of cortex become selective for faces, places, or bodies? Another angle on this is that this hypothesis requires a person to decide what counts as a face or a place or a body. We have to ask people if an image contains those things in order to decide whether we think that region is going to respond selectively. And so another concern is that these word model claims don't explain stable differences in the magnitude of response of those regions to different faces. So the face area doesn't respond the same to all faces. And if we just say it's face selective, that doesn't account for those differences. It also doesn't account for the fact that the face area may respond differently to, say, a picture of a dog versus a tree versus a toaster. And those are stable differences that this claim doesn't account for. So those are shortcomings of the claims of category selectivity. So the second question is, even if we could deal with those shortcomings, do we even have confidence that these claims of category selectivity are true? And on the one hand, there's loads of evidence, dozens of papers about each of these regions, most of them providing very strong support for these claims of category selectivity. On the other hand, if you look across all those papers, there's really only, I don't know, maybe a few hundred different stimuli or kinds of stimuli that have been tested. And so claims of category selectivity are inherently reckless. They're claims that of the nearly infinite set of possible stimuli out there, no non-face image will produce a really strong response in the face area, no non-place in the place area, and no non-body image in the body area. And that's reckless because there are lots and lots of kinds of images that nobody's tested yet. And so these hypotheses could be very straightforwardly refuted. So for example, suppose somebody comes along and says, okay, I scanned people looking at pineapples, and I found that the response in the fusiform face area is higher for pineapples or tow trucks or whatever else than faces in the face area. If somebody does that, the jig's up, the hypothesis is wrong, end of story. And so there's just a lot of ways that these hypotheses could be refuted because, you know, we haven't tested that many stimuli. And most importantly, we don't know what other stimuli to test to try to refute this hypothesis. For the first decade or two, we would sit around and think, it's like, okay, maybe that face area, maybe it's just responding to round things. Maybe it's just responding to animate things. Maybe it's just responding to things with 2 dots. And so we refuted those hypotheses, but that left open a space of all of these others, and we don't know now which ones to test. So that leaves people like me who want to stake out a pretty extreme version of the category selectivity hypothesis in a vulnerable position. Okay, so that's question 2. Third question, why and how might we have category selectivity in the first place? Why is that a good design for a brain? And how might it arise in development? And in particular, in order to build a brain that has selective machinery for faces, do you need to build in something special right innately to get that to develop? Or can face selective machinery just arise spontaneously from experience with faces, even if there's no domain-specific predisposition? Okay, that's the agenda. And so how can we address these questions? Well, today I will argue that convolutional neural networks will give us important clues into answering each of these questions. And I'm very surprised to be staking out this position. Just a few years ago, I was hoping that these things would go away so I wouldn't have to learn about them. But I've quite come around because I think there are just many, many ways that they're proving very powerful in answering longstanding questions in cognition. So I'm going to make that case today that we can address each of these questions with convolutional neural networks. We can ask whether we can make more precise definitions of what it means to say that a region is selective for faces, places, or bodies by building convolutional neural network-based models that predict the response in each region. Once we have those, we can then use those models to turbocharge our efforts to refute those hypotheses and thereby to subject them to very strong tests. And we can also build models, to convolutional neural network models, to ask whether you can ever get category selectivity emerging spontaneously in a model without building in any kind of prior that should make that happen. So I'll start in a moment with the first work. This is work by Ratan Murthy, addressing this first question here. He's a postdoc in my lab, and he's done just very beautiful work here. Also working with Pooya Bashavan, who's now a professor in Canada, and Jim DiCarlo, my colleague, who really did more than I think anyone else to launch this whole revolution in the methods we have to understand the computational basis of visual recognition in the brain. And an undergrad named Alex Abate, who's been working closely with Ratan on this work. So let's dive in. With first some bare basics on what convolutional neural networks are. I know this is a broad audience I'm speaking to, so let me just share the basics. A convolutional neural network is a computer model of a process. In this case, we're talking about object recognition, and it's a series of layers. So you stick a stimulus in the front end, you feed an image into this algorithm, and the algorithm is implemented in a series of layers where each layer contains a large number of units that are very abstractly neuron-like. And each unit gets input from the layer before and sums over a bunch of units in the layer before with variable weights to produce some computation. And after a series of these computations, you end up, in this case, with a layer of object identities, say 1,000 object identities. And so the activation that you end up at the top layer tells you what that image is. In this case, you feed the system an orange, and it outputs the fact that there's an orange in that image. And these models are very much like the connectionist networks that we had way back in the 1980s, except that now we have much more powerful computers and huge training sets of millions of labeled images that have just taken these models and made them suddenly work really well at object recognition. Suddenly, as of 2012, these things can really perform nearly at human levels at basic object recognition tasks. And so that mere fact that these systems now work really well gives us, for the first time, an image computable model. That means a model where you stick an image in here and you get an answer out the other end. It's not just a kind of name for what might happen. It's an actual algorithm that actually works quite well on object recognition. So that now gives us a hypothesis of how this might work in the brain. And that's the first time we've had that. And so that's a big deal. Second, these convolutional neural networks have already been shown to resemble processing in the primate visual pathway to a remarkable degree. So here's some data from a really seminal paper that kind of launched this whole line of work by Dan Yammans and Jim DiCarlo and others. And what they showed is that in black, you see the response of a site in infratemporal cortex in a monkey brain. So this is a high-level stage of visual processing, showing you the response of that one site to 100 or more different images in different categories. And so you can see that that site is face selective. It responds much more to faces than anything else. But in red is the predicted response of that site based on a linear weighted sum of units in a CNN model. And so that shows that we can use these CNN models to predict the response of a site in IT cortex. And that suggests a strong match between the model and what that site in the brain is doing. So that's pretty amazing. But even more cool is that there seems to be layer-wise correspondence. So if you consider the model arrayed in here and the brain with visual processing from the back and the occipital lobe going forward up the temporal lobe, you see that early stages of the model seem to roughly match early stages of processing in the brain, mid stages match mid stages, and late stages of the model match higher level stages of processing in IT cortex, both in monkeys and in humans. And that's pretty amazing. So now the question I want to approach here that Ratan has been working on is, can we now use these convolutional neural network models to make predictive models of the face area, the place area, and the body area? So how would that go? So here's what Ratan did. He first scanned participants while they viewed a broad sample of natural images, a set of 185 different images, some of which are shown here. There are 25 faces, 50 body and body part images, 50 scenes, 65 objects, very rich naturalistic images. We get 20 repetitions per image per person. That means we scan each person for 10 hours, not all in one go. But that's still a lot of scanning for one person. And we do that because we want very precise measurements of exactly how strongly does each 3D pixel or voxel in their brain respond to each of these images. And so that gives us, for each region of interest in the brain, say it could be primary visual cortex or the fusiform face area, we get a magnitude of response to each of those 185 images. Okay, so now what we do is we look in the face area, the place area, and the body area. And we define these the way we've been doing in my lab for 20 years. Pop subjects in the scanner, show them faces, places, bodies, and objects. Find the bit in this approximate neighborhood in the fusiform gyrus that responds more to faces and objects, that's the FFA. The bit that responds more to places and objects, that's the PPA. The bit that responds more to bodies and objects, that's the EBA. So that's a localizer. We just find those regions in each subject. And then in the separate scan with the 85 images, we measure the mean response in each of those regions across our 85 images. So here is now from one subject, the response in the right fusiform gyrus right there, to the 185 images. And you can see the more orange it is, the stronger the response. So you can see a higher response to faces than other things. And the vertical axis shows you different voxels or pixels in that person's fusiform face area, showing you that all of those voxels in there respond more to faces than to other things, kind of basically replicating the conditions by which that region was defined. So that's just kind of a reality check. But then we can average across voxels and get this vector of response across the 185 images here. Okay. And as Vaishnavi said, feel free to interrupt at any point if I'm saying something that isn't clear. Okay, so you can just blur it out or you can write it in the chat window, and I'm trusting Vaishnavi to tell me if there's a question I need to answer. Okay, so now that we have this response here, now we can build a CNN model that tries to predict the response of the FFA to each image. So how do we do that? We take 90% of the stimuli and we fit a set of weights from a given layer of the model. So we might look in layer 5 of the model and say, okay, let's feed each of these images in here. Let's collect a set of responses to that image across units in this layer 5. And then over our 90% of stimuli, let's choose weights from those units that when summed together fit the mean FFA response to that image. Okay? So that's just choosing the weights in here. Once we've done that, we can then test whether this works in the 10% held out data from the held out stimuli by feeding those stimuli through, propagating them through the network, collecting their activation magnitudes, multiplying the response of each of these units by the weight we decided on before to get a predicted response to that image. And then we can compare that predicted response to the one we actually observed. And so the key questions we're going to ask here is, yeah, question, shoot.
There's a question which says that how is CNN any different than a regular neural network?
Oh, sorry, good question. The CNN just means convolutional neural network. And convolutional means that there's a set of operations at these early stages that are very similar across the whole spatial extent of the layer, right? So each little operator is looking at basically a region of space, especially at the early stages, and it does basically the same operation all over that layer. So it's convolutional in that sense that there's a filter that we slide all over the image. And that's the part that was based on earlier work in neuroscience, because that's what the visual system does. You can see that in V1. And so that inspired these models to do these convolutional operations. But it's just a neural network like any other. It's just that because it's processing visual information, we can take a clue from the structure of the visual system and build in these convolutional operators, which just means that same filter slides all over the image, and that's what happens over this layer. Okay, good question. Okay, so once we build this thing, our first question is, well, how well does this work? How accurately can we predict the response to held out images? So let's look at this here this way. So here's data from a single subject. On the x-axis, we'll have the observed response. So here's one data point from one of those images, one of those 185 images. This is the magnitude of observed response in the FFA to that image. Here's the magnitude of predicted response from that model when we built a model based on the other images, not including this one. Okay, so these are always cross-validated. So the question is, how strongly will predicted and observed responses match? Will we see just a mess, a sphere of dots that has no correlation, or a pretty good correlation between predicted and observed? That's the question. What do we see? Well, we see a pretty good correlation, an R value of 0.86, showing extremely accurate ability of these models to predict the response to a held out image. And that's quite amazing. It's further true within the preferred stimuli. So all of these blue dots here are face images. And you can see, even if you look only at those, you still see this model can predict that one face image can accurately predict that one face image will produce a higher response than another face image. It's not just that it predicts that face responses are higher than non-face images. It can also predict the response among the non-faces down here. So each of those correlations are separately strong and significant. So this model works really well, and it's not just predicting the responses at the level of the category, it's predicting responses at the level of individual images within a category. Okay, so that's just one subject. What about other subjects? Here's the data I showed you before. That was actually their left FFA. Here's their right FFA, pretty similar. And here are 3 other subjects. And so you can see that all of these subjects show a similar thing. We can build these strongly predictive models that are highly accurate for individual images. So what about other brain regions beyond the FFA? How about the EBA, the body area, and the place area? Well, here's what we see when we do the same analysis on the EBA. Again, strong predictions in each subject individually, separately strong predictions within the preferred stimuli, in this case bodies, and the non-preferred stimuli, in this case all the non-body images. What about the PPA? Well, same deal. We get, again, strong predictions in the parahippocampal place area, both separately for within places and within non-places, and of course across the 2. So where are, yeah, question, shoot.
Is that the units in the fully kited layer are tuned to predict the bold responses?
They're not set up that way in particular. The units are simple. That network is just trained on object recognition. It doesn't know that we're going to use that network to test fit to the brain. It is just optimized to get really, really good at object recognition. And then once it gets really good at object recognition, we say, okay, here's a network that's good at object recognition. Does it resemble what goes on in the brain? Can we use that network to model what happens in the face, place, and body areas? So we then take that network. We haven't messed with it. We just left it. It was just optimized for object recognition. But now that we have it, we can pull out activation from units in that network and try to get them to build this model of the FFA, PPA, and EBA, and then we then ask how well that prediction works. So that's what we're doing here. And the finding is that prediction works really, really well. And that suggests that the model is capturing a lot of what is going on in the brain, even though the model wasn't designed to fit the brain. It was merely designed to be good at object recognition. And so it's a really non-obvious, cool fact that these models fit the brain at all. They absolutely didn't have to. And it suggests, actually, to go far beyond the data, to speculate, it suggests that the computational requirement of object recognition imposes constraints that are strong enough that the way the model figures out how to do it and the way that evolution has figured out how to do it in brains end up being pretty similar. Okay?
There's another question.
Yep.
Would the CNN trained on all but one category predict the response to the held out category?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I forget if we've done exactly that. That is a really good question. I'm sure that it would, but I'm trying to think if we have the actual analysis that has done that. We've done many, many folds of leaving out stimuli. But it's a great question whether you can leave out a whole category. Whoever asked that, great question. Send me an email and I will have Ratan engage in that question. And I'm actually really curious about the answer as well. So great question.
Hi, Nancy. I'm here actually.
Hey, Ratan, welcome. Ratan is here. Okay, I didn't know that. Great. Go ahead and have you done that analysis?
No, we haven't done this specific version. We've tried the other way. So I think the question is, can you, if you have a CNN trained on all but one category?
Oh, okay. I misunderstood it. I thought they were saying using the MRI data from all but one category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, you meant, okay. So only use the MRI data. For example, the extreme case. Try to build a model of the FFA using the response of only the other stimuli, not including the face responses.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. No, we haven't tried that version.
It's a great idea. Let's do that, Ratan.
Yep.
Love it. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, and so if Ratan is there, that's great. You can also just, maybe Ratan can also answer questions in the chat window in parallel. I'm happy to as well, but he's the one who really knows what's going on here. Okay, So where are we? So what this means is we now have image computable models with high predictive accuracy for the FFA, PPA, and EBA. It predicts responses to individual images, not just categories. And in other data I'm not showing here, it outperforms human judgments of just how face-like, body-like, or scene-like an image is. So it knows something more than just what humans do when they say, how much is that image like a face? If we use that to try to predict the response, the models do better than that. Even cooler, we asked a bunch of experts in the field, people who have published many papers on the responses of these regions in the brain, and we asked them to predict the response to each of these images, and the models do better than the experts in the field. And that means that the models somehow know something, embody some kind of predictive knowledge that experts like me and many others don't have. Okay, also these models work well across individuals. You can train them up on the data from one subject and use those data to predict responses in another subject. And that's all very cool. But I would strongly submit that this doesn't mean that we now cast aside word models. We still need those word models. Why? Because the word models embody an understanding that we already have of what a face, place, and body is, why it's important to us evolutionarily in daily life, what significance these stimuli have to us, how our ability to perceive these stimuli may have changed over development and over evolution. The point is that faces, places, and bodies are real things in the world, and their significance in the world is relevant to why we have these things in the brain. And so we do not want to cast aside that whole rich understanding from fields adjacent to computational neuroscience. Rather, we want these two understandings to complement each other. So given that these word models are important, we need to know if they're true. So that brings us to question 2. Is the category selectivity even true? So now that we have these strongly predictive models, and just reminding you, they could easily be wrong. As I mentioned before, we've only measured the response of these regions, we the field, to a few hundred stimuli. So there's plenty of ways to refute them. And it's entirely possible that we've missed so far the stimuli that would refute the hypotheses. Oh, Vaishnavi, chime in.
Yeah, there's one question. What is word model?
What does it mean?
What does word model mean?
Yeah. So this is this phrase. I don't know if anybody other than Jim DiCarlo uses it, but he uses it a lot and he's a smart guy. So it's worth paying attention to, even if it's just him. What he means by that is just saying this patch of brain responds selectively to faces, period. That's basically what I've been saying for 20 some years. And his point is that is just a statement in words. There's no algorithm behind it that says, what might the computations be in the brain that enable that patch of brain to become selective to faces? Right? So the whole point of this enterprise is, I think that it's worth knowing whether a patch of the brain responds selectively to faces. It matters for all kinds of things and understanding minds and brains. But at the same time, it is not a computationally explicit model because it's just a string of words. There's no algorithm behind it. Okay, so that's what I'm contrasting here. I'm arguing that both of these things are important. The word model that enables us to communicate this rich, interesting idea that taps into everything we know about the world and our own experience and evolution and development and all of that. That's what the word model makes possible. But at the same time, we want to know actually what's computed in the brain. And these computational models now enable us to do that. Okay. So, yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Am I interrupting?
No, I thought there was another question. Okay.
There is another question.
Okay, go ahead.
It says, how do you select the units for tuning to different responses of FFA, PPA, and EBA?
Yep. Okay, so what you do is you basically run a big regression, right? So you have all of those units and their responses to 90% of the stimuli. You have the response of all those units to 90% of the stimuli that you fed in. And you basically fit weights to each of those units so that you can predict the response of the known response of the FFA by a linear weighted sum of the responses of units. Okay, so it's just a big regression that gives you those weights. And then once you have those weights, based on that regression over 90% of the stimuli, you then test them in the held out stimuli and you see whether they generalize to new stimuli. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, if there are other questions, like butt in again or ask Ratan in the chat window. Okay, so we're getting this question of, okay, because we care about these word models, we care about whether it's actually true, not just that we can predict the response in the FFA with a computational model, but is that response actually selective for faces, right? So that means we want to go back and really test this hypothesis in a more powerful way. And the point now is we can use our computational models to more strongly test that hypothesis. And the way we do that is to use the CNN model to turbocharge our search for falsifying information, right? That's what we're supposed to do in science, is try to falsify our beloved hypotheses, try to kill your darlings. And so here we're going to use the computational model to look for any counter evidence. For example, we're going to look for images that are predicted to produce a really strong response in the FFA, but that are not faces. If we found those and that turned out to be true, then the hypothesis would be wrong, and that would be progress. Okay? So how are we going to do that? Now that we have this model that accurately predicts the mean response in the FFA, we feed it images, and we measure responses of these units, and we get the mean predicted response to each of those units. And because it's just a computational model sitting in a computer someplace, we can do this for millions of stimuli. And we can just shove them through the model, collect the unit responses, and get the predicted FFA response to millions of stimuli. Okay, so we did that. By we, I mean Ratan. Ratan ran 3.5 million images through this predicted FFA model and got the predicted response to each of those 3.5 million images. And now the question is, are any of the not, and these images are just from the usual computer science databases. ImageNet is the most famous one. BGG Face is a whole bunch. Did I do that, or did someone else do that? All right, hang on. Now I got to figure out how to clear the annotation. Clear all drawings. Boom. Okay. So now that so we can feed through all these ImageNet images. BGG Face is 600,000 face images. The place data set is another one. We shove them all through, collect their predictive responses, and then we show, whoops, hang on. Then we show here the predicted response of all these images as a histogram, how many images from each of these databases. And the first thing you see is that all the high predicted responses are from the face database. So all those orange images are faces. So to a first approximation, all the top images look like faces. However, if we look at the top images from that big set, and we throw out, like we want to know those very top ones, and we want to not include the face data set. I just want to make sure I'm being called. I hope that's not somebody calling about the talk. If there's a problem with any of you, I'm assuming you'll just butt in. Okay. I think my phone is ringing nonstop because of the big news this morning. I just want to make sure that those phone calls are not telling me that, you know, you guys can no longer hear me or something like that. Okay, so what about those top images? We throw out the face ones because they can't refute our hypothesis, and we ask whether those long tails there include anything that isn't a face. And so now I'm going to show you the top couple hundred images predicted to produce the highest response in the FFA from 3 million images, not including the faces. So what are those images? Well, here are the top 10. And you can see what they are if you look at them. And now let's just scroll and look at the top 200. And you can see that even though we are looking for any counter evidence, we are looking for any images predicted to produce a high response that aren't faces, we don't find them. All the top predicted images are faces. Okay? So that means that even when we look up here, not including the VGG stimuli, ImageNet has lots of images that are faces, and those are the ones that come to the top. Okay, so despite searching through 3.5 million images, looking really hard, using our computational model to find stimuli that might produce counter evidence by predicting a strong response in the FFA, we're not finding them. Okay, so what about when we try that with the EBA? Are any of the top predicted stimuli for the EBA not bodies? Well, here are the top 10, and I don't know if you can see them clearly enough, but every one of those is a body or a body part. And if we now look at the top 200, we see the same deal. None of these images are, all of these images are obviously bodies or body parts, okay? So again, no counter evidence. What about when we look at the PPA? And here we're excluding all the images from the places data set, because we know those are all scenes and those couldn't refute the hypothesis. So looking through the other data sets, we see that in fact, again, all of the top predicted images are all places. Okay. All right. So where are we? We tried really, really hard to find counter evidence against the selectivity of the FFA, PPA, and EBA using our highly predicted models to look for images predicted to produce a strong response that didn't fit the claimed category selectivity, and we just failed. So that suggests that the category selectivity of these regions is just true. However, there is one possible shortcoming of this, and that is this strategy of searching through the images is only as good as our image databases are. Like if the images that would actually refute the hypothesis are not in those image databases, then we wouldn't find them. So we tried another method, and this uses something called a generative adversarial network, or GAN. And what that does is actually synthesize stimuli designed to produce a maximal activation in these regions. So instead of searching through databases, we're going to generate stimuli that our models predict will produce the highest responses. And these GANs have been trained on lots and lots of natural images. So latent in their weight space is kind of knowledge of the structure of the world and of general stimuli. And so they can produce actually quite naturalistic images. And so the question is, what do they produce for the FFA, PPA, and EBA? Drum roll, please. Here's what they produce for the FFA, left FFA, right FFA here. And you can see these images are a little distorted, but very clearly faces, sometimes single faces, sometimes groups of faces. So no counter evidence here. What do we see for the EBA? This really cracks me up. We get things like, knees and trunks, and hands. The fingers aren't necessarily all in the right place, and sometimes there's weird little amalgams, but these are all really obviously abstract bodies and body parts. What do we get for the PPA? Well, we get a bunch of places with sidewalls and blue skies and horizon lines and ground planes and all the things that are that we thought were the standard structure of places that drive the PPA. Okay, so on the second question, we have now evidence that the selectivity of the FFA for faces, PPA for places, and EBA for bodies have now passed these very stringent tests of their selectivity, the searching through image databases and the image generation, image synthesis method with the GANs. And I think that's really important to know. It suggests that these regions really are selective for the categories that we've been saying, now meeting a much higher bar. And I think that's very relevant to how we think about the significance of these regions, how these regions in the brain interface with theories of cognition, of cognitive development and brain development, evolution of the mind and brain. And so I think that's great to know. Further, we can use these models in lots of other ways beyond just retesting the selectivity. We can test different CNN models against neural data from each region. So I described how you would do that with one network, but Ratan has actually done that with 60 different networks. And so you can ask which of those networks best model the brain. And ultimately, that can tell us in the long run which model may actually provide a true computational account of the actual computations in the brain. Because each of those models embodies a hypothesis about the architecture, training, and processing stages that lead up to the regions that we're modeling. And so, for example, we can ask whether the intermediate stages of the model, before the units that we pull out to model the FFA, PPA, and EBA, do those intermediate stages model intermediate stages in the brain, like maybe the occipital face area or the occipital place area. Further, there are increasingly many methods to actually treat these models not just as black boxes that enable us to predict, but as things that we can analyze in their own right and to actually understand how they work. So we can do things like lesioning parts of the model, and I'll show you how that goes in a second. We can visualize their responses to different features and understand those models that are accounting for so much of the variance in neural responses. And third, we can use these models to discover novel functional selectivities of less understood regions. So Ratan is now using these models to understand some of those other regions of the brain beyond the face, place, and body regions to say, okay, how about that little patch right there? What is it really selective for? Well, we can apply these same methods to look at that kind of question. So I think there's loads of potential with these models. But I now want to turn to the third question, where we can use CNNs in a quite different way to ask, why and how do we have category selectivity? Why should brains have this kind of organization in the first place? And how might it develop? In particular, do you need to build in something to get category selective functions out of a convolutional neural network? Can they arise spontaneously, or do you have to build in something to get it to produce that architecture? Okay, so this is work by Katerina Dobbs, a recent postdoc in my lab, who started her own lab in Germany yesterday, or the day before October 1st, along with Alex Kell, a postdoc at Columbia, my fabulous lab tech, Julio Martinez, and my fabulous lab tech, Julio Martinez. And so we start by asking, why might faces and objects be processed separately in the brain in the first place? Why is that a good design strategy for a brain? And might that design emerge spontaneously in a network that's just optimized to be good at visual recognition? Okay, so we start with the hypothesis that the ideal feature spaces for recognizing faces and recognizing objects may just be so different that you need separate systems to get high accuracy at both tasks. Okay, so we ask that question first by starting with one of the standard convolutional neural networks. This is AlexNet, and we train it on the faces in the VGG face data set. So this is a data set that has 1,000 different identities and with around 1,000 different images of each identity. And so you train and train and train this model to adjust its weights so it becomes really, really good at recognizing those 1,000 faces, okay? So now we call that a face CNN because it was trained on faces and is good at face recognition. But now we can ask, now that it's trained on face recognition, what kinds of features has it learned to be good at face recognition? And would those features be very useful for object recognition? Okay, so we can ask that by getting rid of those 1,000 categories face categories it was trained on, and pulling out its responses from its penultimate layer, using those responses to try to read out what's in there by training a linear classifier, just a simple readout mechanism to say, can we use those representations to recognize new faces it wasn't trained on, or object that it was never trained on? And what we find is, yes, here's decoding accuracy. If you feed new faces through here, collect their activations, run it through this classifier, you see that it's actually very accurate at recognizing new faces it was not trained on, but it's really bad at recognizing objects, which it's never seen. Okay, so this feature space that it has learned to make it really good at face recognition is great for recognizing new faces, but really bad at recognizing new objects, okay? So that suggests, so what about the opposite? What if we train a network on object recognition? Will that work for face recognition? Okay, so here we do the opposite. We take the same architecture, but we train it up on 423 categories of objects. We throw out all the faces and animals and bodies from the data set, the training set, so it's trained only on inanimate objects. And it gets really good at object classification, but then we can feed it objects and faces, novel objects and faces. Again, we throw away the last layer and we read out the features when we feed in these images, and we ask whether those responses are, enable us to do face discrimination and object discrimination. And what we find is those features are good for object recognition and lousy for face recognition. And what that means is, indeed, if you optimize the features you need for face recognition, they're bad for object recognition. If you optimize the features you need for object recognition, they're bad for face recognition. And so we think maybe that's why the brain has separate patches for processing faces and objects, is you just need fundamentally different features for those two things, as we see here with these computational models. So that's neat. But next question, how would you build these segregated systems in the brain? Do you have to start with a network where you say, okay, here's your face pathway, only let the faces in here and only train them here. Here's your object pathway, only let the objects in here, only train it up on objects here? Or might the network be so smart it can figure out to make segregated pathways? So to figure that out, we trained not just networks on just faces or just objects, but we trained a third class of networks on both. So these networks are trained on both face and object recognition. The faces and objects are fed through the network. This is now a VGG architecture. It doesn't really matter, it's just got more layers. And so now that the question is, can this network learn to do both tasks, as well as each of these networks does its own single task? Okay, so here's performance on the face-only network doing face recognition and the object-only network doing object recognition. As a sidebar, you see that actually there's also another interesting little message in here. So for years, one of the hypotheses we'd had about why would the brain have special machinery for face recognition, our hypothesis was, oh, face recognition is just harder than object recognition. Faces are so similar to each other, so it's a really hard task, so maybe you need extra neurons and you put them all in one place in the brain. This says no, actually in convolutional neural networks, face recognition is an easier task than object recognition. So there's another little message we can learn there. But my main question now is, what about this dual trained network? Can it do as well as the singly trained networks? And the answer is yes, it can do both tasks. But now the question, well, is how, it can do both tasks because it's trained on both, as well as the singly trained networks. But how does it do it? That's the question. Has it accomplished this by somehow discovering that the way to do that task is to branch and have separate branches for faces and objects that it has spontaneously discovered? And the way we ask that question is to lesion the network and find out, just as we use lesions in studying the human brain to discover that there's separate pathways for faces and objects, we lesion different parts of the network to ask if it has functional segregation hiding within it, okay? And so what we do is we basically take units at each layer one at a time. We go through each of the units, measuring how much performance on face recognition drops when we throw out that unit, how much does performance on object recognition drop if we throw out that unit, and we rank order the units by their importance in face recognition, okay? And then we drop the top 30% units that we think are most important for face recognition, and we look at performance on held out stimuli. And what we see here, this is now the ratio of the drop in performance in face recognition to the drop in performance of object recognition as a function of which layer we drop those units from. And what this basically means is that if you drop units from one of those higher layers of the network up here, those higher convolutional layers, you drop the top 30% of face units, you get a 6-fold bigger hit in face recognition performance than you get in object recognition performance. So we're basically creating prosopagnosia in the network by finding the right units to drop, dropping them, and then testing performance on held out stimuli. And if we do the opposite, it's not shown here, we drop the units that are most important for object recognition, we also get a bigger hit on object recognition than face recognition. So we have a double dissociation in this network. And yes, it has spontaneously invented the importance of task segregation. And we think that's pretty awesome and cool. And it tells us that it is at least in principle possible to develop domain-specific machinery without building in a prior in the system that says you should have separate pathways for faces. It can discover this spontaneously. Well, that's all in principle arguments in the air based on neural networks. What about actual brains? So how does category selectivity develop in actual brains? I'm not going to answer that. I'm just going to show you 2 cool pieces of data. So we just made the case that from CNNs that it is possible in principle to get spontaneous segregation without building it in innately. Okay, what about actual brains? We don't know. And the data I'm going to show you are in some sense kind of contradictory, and none of these pieces fit together, but the data are cool. So I'm going to briefly show you 2 cool bits of data before closing. Okay. So first of all, the amazing Heather Kosakowski, a grad student working with me and Rebecca Sachs, has been scanning infants. She has scanned something like 80 infants over the last 5 years. It's almost impossible. This is truly heroic science. There have been many innovations, from figuring out how to get the infants to be calm and to hold still, to figuring out, working with physicists to design specialized MRI coils that give us good data from infant brains and keep them comfortable and happy. Leaving out all the details, the fruits of this 5 years of work is that Heather is now finding that 6-month-old infants have a fusiform face area. Here it is in a group analysis of 23 infants, showing you a higher response to faces and objects. They have PPAs right in the right place, a higher response to scenes and objects. And they have extrastriate body regions, a higher response to bodies and objects, just in the right place where you'd expect it. These statistics are at a very permissive statistical threshold, so they're more illustrative. But if we use the region of interest method that my lab has been using on adults for 20 years, by defining those voxels in one set of data and then measuring the response magnitude in left out data, we see that the FFA in infants responds significantly more to faces than bodies, objects, and scenes. Each of those stats is significant. The PPA has a significantly higher response to scenes than faces, bodies, and objects. And the EBA has a significantly higher response to bodies than faces and objects and scenes. And I find that quite remarkable. It tells us that these regions already show approximately adult-like selectivity already in 6-month-old infants. And that is a technical tour de force that Heather and Rebecca mostly carried out. And it's very, very early to see this approximately adult-like selectivity already by 6 months. So that's a really important constraint on how these things might develop. On the other hand, 6-month-old infants have still had a bunch of visual experience. And so that does not tell us that these things are innate and hardwired. We don't actually know whether it's learned or not at this age. It constrains the amount of experience they could have had to build this selectivity, but there's still a bunch they've had. Okay, so next question, is visual experience actually necessary to build an FFA? So here we come back to Ratan Murthy and his amazing paper that he just published in PNAS a month or so ago. And this is very different than the other work I talked about. And here I'll just mention it briefly since it's published. What Ratan did was say, let's ask whether you need visual experience to build a face selective patch of cortex by testing people who never had that experience, congenitally blind people. Okay, so what he did was to scan congenitally blind people while they haptically explored 3D printed models of faces or objects or scenes or bodies, in this case, hands. So the subjects are lying in the scanner, feeling these stimuli with their hands, people who have never seen, they're congenitally blind, and we're scanning them while they feel these different stimuli, asking whether we see face selectivity in the brain. So first I'm going to show you control data from sighted subjects seeing the very same stimuli. So that just shows you what we've published a million times already and other people have. Face selectivity in the fusiform gyrus, higher responses to faces than objects, hands, and in this case, chairs. What do we see in the blind subjects? It's really similar. We see face selective responses in the same location of the brain in blind people feeling faces, scenes, hands, and objects, okay? So what does that tell us? That tells us that visual experience is not necessary to get selective responses in the fusiform gyrus to faces. Now, it doesn't still tell us whether that response is innate, because blind people have tactile experience. It only tells us that visual experience isn't necessary. Maybe tactile experience is enough to wire up those regions. So I end with kind of a mess. We don't know the answer to how these things develop, but we have some cool new constraints for thinking about it. First, we know that selectivity arises very early, within 6 months of age, and that's a powerful constraint. Second, we know that in principle, it's possible, at least in a convolutional model, for selectivity to arise spontaneously without building in a domain-specific prior. And third, we know that it is possible in actual human brains to develop face selectivity in people who have never had visual experience with faces. So I don't yet know how to put those pieces together. If I had to wildly speculate, I would say that because face specificity makes sense computationally, as we showed with that in the last part with Katerina's work, evolution may have given us multiple routes by which to develop it, from optimizing based on visual experience, like we see in computational models, to maybe having some kind of domain-specific prior that enables the system to be built even in people without visual experience. So we'll need more data to make further progress on that question. And I'll just end by re-acknowledging the people who did this work, Ratan Murthy. And by the way, Ratan is going to finish his postdoc sometime in the next year or two, and any department that managed to hire him as a faculty member would be lucky indeed. So keep your eyes out for that. The amazing Heather Kosakowski, who is able to get beautiful data from infants like literally no one else on the planet can. We'll be looking for a postdoc in a year or two. And Katerina Dobbs just started her own lab at Gießen, Germany, and is looking for grad students and postdocs. And I strongly recommend getting in touch with her if you're interested in that. And finally, I want to re-acknowledge my wonderful lab. These people are smart and innovative and have all kinds of technical skills that I don't. And most importantly, they're willing to try all kinds of crazy stuff with me. And with that, I will end by thanking you and taking other questions.
Thank you, Nancy, for a pretty penetrating talk. That was probably it's at the cutting edge of computational cognitive neuroscience. I have this program is catering to a lot of people from diverse fields. So there are a few experts who work with these techniques, as you already have seen their names from India. And there are other people from other fields. So I will play the devil's advocate, asking some questions that are not directly on the data or etc. Because I think that's important. So my first question is: you appear to be a very decisive believer in the structure-function relationship. How true is that? What's your feeling about that? Like you have to be, most of your data, I looked at some past papers as well, that every structure has a predefined function, biologically determined.
We don't know pre. We don't know pre, right? Yes. I mean, I think there's a very tight mapping. Like every person that we've scanned has a fusiform base area. It's always on the lateral side of the fusiform gyrus. There's some anatomical variability across subjects on exactly where it lands, but you find it in pretty much every subject. Further, in data I didn't show here, there are systematic long-range connections of that patch of cortex to other parts of the brain. And so that's another aspect of that hardware that has a systematic relationship to the functional signature of that region. In fact, my postdoc long ago, Zeynep Sagan, showed that you can predict exactly where a person's fusiform face area will land in the fusiform gyrus from only the patterns of connectivity of that patch of brain. There is a connectivity fingerprint of that functional region. And third, in work from Colony Gross-Spector, she's been using these fancy imaging methods where you can look at proxies for histology, for cytoarchitectonic properties of the cell structure and layer structure of the cortex. And she argues that the FFA and PPA are cytoarchitectonically distinct. So that's another kind of link between the hardware and the function. So it's not that I'm a believer in the sense of, you know, it's my favorite ideology. It's that I think there's substantial evidence for the link between the function of those regions and their physical hardware. But still, that doesn't tell us that they're built in innately, right? That could, all of that could develop based on experience.
If experience plays, obviously experience plays a role, but some of your data, like the last one, suggests that without even visual exposure, the critical brain areas start firing where you were top. So that throws a big question mark on people who have never had any sensation at all. And they were saying
well,
that.
wait. So they've had sensation, not vision, right? So we don't know what the blind subjects, so blind people don't use touch for face recognition routinely, right? They have experience touching faces, their own face, probably their parents' face, maybe close loved ones' faces, but they don't go around routinely using touch to identify people. They use voices, not touch. So we can't say that there's no sensory experience of faces with blind people because they have touched them. But on the other hand, we can certainly say that they don't have extensive expertise at fine-grained face discrimination by touch, right? So by the way, those data also rule out the expertise hypothesis, which was already dead long ago. But if anybody still thinks it's an interesting debate, it's even deader now.
It's certainly a striking piece of work, and it is surprising at the same time.
I mean, we are blown away. Like, I'm really shocked. Like, I wanted to do this experiment.
And I know how difficult it must be to collect that kind of data, considering the many ethical and other aspects of doing this kind of high-end science. So, now coming to the, most of your, a lot of the data are based on images that are collected, clicked by people, and you try to fit in them and try to train algorithms. And a lot of time we think that, well, one image differs from another image. There is actual questions with regard to faces and how a model would be competent in doing this fine tuning that a Chinese face as opposed to a South Korean space, because it has applied value, which I believe it has, like the camera systems in airports and elsewhere. That question was, to what extent they can be trusted?
Well, I think we should never operate on trust, right? What we should operate on is the data we have, and the data we have show that within the domain that we've tested, these models are very strongly predictive, and that includes, I didn't get into this in detail, but the stimuli in Ratan's model building studies are from this Things database. It's 26,000 nice, high quality natural images, and they're not like, all front view faces. They're all different kinds of images. And so the fact that the model is able to use that really quite heterogeneous set of stimuli shows quite a bit of ability to generalize across viewpoint and lighting and background and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's great. However, the model is originally trained only on naturalistic photographs, okay? So that's all it's seen. And so there are some kinds of stimuli for which those models do not work well. Either their performance is bad if you just ask them what's in that image, and excuse me, their ability to model the brain is also going to be weaker. So, for example, if you show line drawings of objects, these models do not work well with line drawings, but humans do, right? So there are many cases where the models do not fit what humans can do. They account for a lot of variance, but not all of it. Similarly, if you show people a stick figure of a body, people just immediately know, yeah, that's a person, that's a stick figure, it's a body. And similarly, the extrastriate body area responds strongly to stick figures of bodies, much more so than if you take the same stick figure and move around its parts, okay? But the computational models don't get that. They have not been trained on stimuli that are that abstract. Yeah. So there's a half full, half empty thing here. The half empty thing is, okay, those models are not capturing everything that matters about humans, not even close. That's true, they don't. The half full part is, okay, that's great. We can use them to build on, and those error modes, those failure modes, tell us what we need to do to build better models. And so we can iteratively loop back and say, okay, here are the things the models don't account for. Now let's build better ones that can operate on the broader range of stimuli, and then go back and test those in the brain. So I think there's a lot of potential here to not trust the models, but use them as intermediate stages in a long-term project of making better models that account for more variance, and using the failures of the models to make better models.
Yeah. So I'm very fascinated by these discoveries with 6-month-old infants being showing the brain regions or visualizations. I was thinking, let's consider that we are operating in a very different world now, and many parents are wearing face masks, and those children that were born in March, and it's already 6-7 months down, so do you expect them to, those brain regions to develop more variant, because it's not the normal faces they're seeing, if they're at all.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. Yes, I thought about that too, and I thought a few months ago, I was like, okay, I got to quickly like design an experiment and exploit this opportunity, and then I thought, we're all doing what we're doing now. We're on Zoom all the time, looking at faces, seeing the whole face without the mask. We're watching movies because we're stuck at home, and so there's some kind of change in our experience, but it's not as pervasive as I think it would need to be to get a big effect. So I think in principle, it's a super interesting question, but I think the manipulation we're all, being forced into right now isn't pervasive enough to likely produce a big effect. But it reminds me actually that you mentioned the other race cases, and I think a whole other use of these models that Katerina Dobbs is doing is she's asking whether the many, and this is another way that I think the models can really dovetail very interestingly with the long running work on, behavioral work on humans. So you can ask, so there's, as I'm sure many of you guys know, there's been, decades, 30, 40 years of work on how people recognize faces, holistic processing, inversion effects, part whole effects, all that stuff that's been going on for a long time, all of which has turned up these very kind of interesting properties of how face recognition works in the human brain. But missing from all of that work is a question of why. It's just like, okay, here's how we have, it has this property, has that property, has this property, has that property. We list them. A list isn't a theory, it's a list. It's a characterization in a way. But what Katerina Dobbs is now asking is whether CNNs trained at face recognition that get really good at face recognition also show those same properties. To the extent that they do, that's a kind of account of why. It would tell us that likely the reason our face system has these kind of interesting characteristics and behaves in this very particular way is that is what an optimized solution to face recognition entails, right? To the extent that we find similar stuff in a CNN that has not been pre-programmed to do any of that, it has only been optimized for face recognition. If it develops those same features, then that would tell us that these are what optimized systems do. And I think that's a really cool use of CNNs. We're basically treating them as ideal observers. Much like the whole line of work in lower level vision has asked, why do we have contrast sensitivity and orientation sensitivity and all of these low level visual properties? Why do those systems behave the way they do? And that question has been asked by building mathematical models, ideal observer models, and saying that many of those properties are just what an ideal observer should do. What the CNNs are enabling us to do is generalize that kind of ideal observer logic up to higher levels of processing that can't be captured by the linear math of standard ideal observer models, but can be captured by CNNs. So I think that's a really exciting direction of the field. Sorry, that was too long an answer.
Yeah. So, well, throughout the talk, many people, they kept on asking various questions, and already I think we have had a lot of Q&A going on. So I will, this is my last question, or an opinion rather. Computation, after all, is not ontologically true, as John Searle would like to say. That
Sorry,
is,
I'm not exactly hearing. Say that last bit again.
Computation is not ontologically a fact of nature, but brains are. Now, when you bring computation and brains together, then the problem begins. Is the brain really producing stuff the way we think the neural network model that apparently, takes in data? And so that it is a philosophical question, and I'm quite sure that—
I disagree. It's not a philosophical question. It's a scientific question, right? So the claim that the brain is a computational system is not an empirical claim. It is a framework that we use to ask, to kind of launch a direction of science, right? So, we could ask, is the solar system a computational system? It's computing, Kepler's laws. Well, we could do that, but it's not very fruitful and it doesn't take us very far. In contrast, when we think of the brain as a computational system, it's taken us very far. We've been able to account for all kinds of data we couldn't account for otherwise. And so I think the question is, it's not a philosophical question, it's an empirical question how of particular computational models, how well they will capture the data. And so I think it's really empirical. And I think, the data so far is really quite amazing in showing the ability to capture a substantial amount of data. In a whole other line of work, and you can apply these things across the board. In a whole other line of work from Ev Fedorenko's lab that I'm only peripherally involved in, there are all these natural language processing computational models, right? And so you can say,
I believe a lot of work he does is on dyslexia. Yeah.
Sorry?
On dyslexics reading.
Yeah, well, these are actually rather different. So these are natural language processing models that understand language, right? So they've been getting a lot of press with GPT-3 that's freaking everybody out because it can answer questions and all of that, right? So that's one of a whole suite of computational models that seem to be pretty good at language understanding that are just basically networks trained on huge piles of language corpuses, right? And so then we can ask, okay, let's look at the language parts of the brain. And let's ask to what extent we can fit, just as I talked about here today, can we fit neural responses to language to those NLP computational models? And that too is working quite well and proving extremely informative. So I think across the board, we can ask in each of these domains to what extent different kinds of computational models fit the available data. What ways do they not fit? How might we change the models to make them fit better? I think it's a very productive and exciting line of empirical work. It's not a philosophical claim.
Well, I would still, maybe I'm using it in the more classical way of talking about these things. But nonetheless, I do take your point that it's an empirical question, and that's how we should do our science. But the interpretations are metaphysical, and they many a time carry our belief, the way we want to explain the world around us. So nonetheless, I now open this to anyone who wants to have an opinion or comment on any one of the things. But I again thank Nancy for taking time and bringing some very fascinating research to all of us. And I can see that a lot of people have taken a great interest. And in India, let me add a couple of words. University of Hyderabad, of which I am a part, and there are many people who are related to University of Hyderabad, is a prominent research university, and the Center for Neurocognitive Science, of which I teach there, is a new center. But in India, we have seen a growth of cognitive science and neuroscience in the last decade or so. Many fMRI systems have been purchased in India in the last decade than they were before. And new neuroscience, very cutting-edge work keep appearing. And many people that I know personally are viewing currently, and you may know them. And there are other people who might be interested as graduate students or postdocs. So one aim of this fora is to really foster that interdisciplinarity and to make them tell that these are exciting things to pursue. And I thank you again for making it very topical, because we didn't have a cognitive neuroscientist speaking to us since we started this program. And it was right on some of the very cutting edge things that should be done. So with these words, I thank you again. And if anybody else has anything to ask Nancy, then please go ahead. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I was wondering that at least cognitive psychological theories give some impetus to biases that come from experience or internal biases, for that matter, when you indulge in very detailed visual processing or attentional processing. So is it possible to train a model on taking into account certain biases from experience, or practically?
Give me an example of what kind of bias you're talking about. Are you talking about stuff like, say, the other race effect in face recognition? Or are you talking about like a social stereotype, or just say more what kind of bias you have in mind?
So if you, let's say I stay in a certain locality and I come across 5 faces that are my neighbors on a regular basis. So the way my brain processes those 5 faces might be different than the way my brain processes novel faces or people I've never come across. So is it possible to train a model to account for these minute differences?
Good. So I mentioned the work that Katarina Dobbs is launching now, using computational models of face recognition to ask which of these many interesting properties of the face system in humans arise naturally in any system optimized for face recognition. And that is one key thing that she's been looking at. So, so you probably know, Vaishnavi, but probably others don't. There's a huge difference in how familiar and unfamiliar faces are processed. And this is shown most dramatically in a paper from a bunch of years ago that showed people an array of around, I don't know, 50 or 100 faces all kind of on a screen. And you ask people how many individuals are depicted here. And it's very hard to tell. It's all these like nice photographs, front view photographs. And most people looking at that array say, I don't know, it's hard to tell, maybe 7 or 8 different people with different images of each one. And the correct answer is there are only 2 people depicted here, right? And yet they're actually all Dutch politicians. And if you do that experiment in Holland, people look at it and in less than a second, they say, well, there's 2 people. You know, it's like Joe and Bob or whoever they are, right? So what that reveals is that our ability to appreciate the sameness of the individual behind different images of a face is vastly better if we know that person than if we don't. And in fact, the job that security people do when they look at your ID and look at you, they're terrible at it, right? Tests have shown these people are just absolutely terrible. You can tell, you know, the age and gender and race and some basic stuff about people, but people are really, really bad at even a same different task of unfamiliar faces. And yet we're really good at that with familiar faces. So there are loads of differences between how we process familiar and unfamiliar faces. And that is absolutely a question that can be asked of computational models. And Katarina is looking at that right now. And by the way, she's also shown using magnetoencephalography that you can see very early on in the response to an image. You know, visual processing happens really fast, most of it within 1/5 of a second. Okay? So around, even before 100 milliseconds, you can get a difference in the MEG response to a face as a function of whether it's familiar or not. And you can decode much more information about the identity of the face and its gender and race if that face is familiar than if it's not.
I just have a follow-up question. And so it sometimes happens that you come across people that you do not want to interact with, or you certainly have a bias that you don't want to look at them or interact with them. So would you think that that kind of an internal bias would show up in the neural activations, that those faces are processed less because you have an internal lack of motivation to interact with them?
Well, certainly, basically all stages of visual processing are affected by visual attention. And so if I am fixating here and there's a face I don't want to process over here, I have a choice. I don't have to attend to it, right? I mean, to some extent, faces try to pull your attention. You probably do some processing, but I could choose to attend to somewhere else, right? And crank down processing. And we showed way back that, you know, you can look in the FFA response and you crank it way down if you're attending away from the faces, right? So you have some choice over that. And there may also be automatic built-in things that, that maybe even unconsciously direct your attention more to people you like than people you don't like. I'm not sure, but it's certainly possible.
All right. I'll take one question from Amaranth, and he says there are studies that show that there is redundancy in the brain. Could there be other areas, considering that face recognition is crucial for survival?
I mean, other face recognition areas. Yeah, in fact, there are. I focus mostly on the FFA today, just for simplicity. But there are a number of different patches of brain in humans that respond selectively to faces. The FFA is the most robust and strongly selective and widely replicated, but there's a little one, you know, a centimeter or two behind it called the occipital face area. It's not quite as selective, it's not quite as robust, but you can detect it in most people. There are also, well, actually there's a region up in the superior temporal sulcus on the lateral side of the temporal lobe that was called the STS face region for about 20 years before a number of people, including us, but not limited to us, found that, whoops, it also responds to voices. So it responds more to faces and objects, but also responds more to voices than other sounds. And so what exactly it's doing is not known, but something quite high level and multimodal. Then there are other more anterior face regions that are harder to study because there are artifacts with MRI data in the anterior part of the temporal lobe. But people do study them, and they seem, so it looks like there's probably a hierarchical series of face processing regions with maybe also some kind of horizontal differentiation between, say, processing identity and emotional expression and other information. But yeah, there are quite a few face processing regions. And of course, it's not like to process faces, you only need an FFA. You need all of these other regions. You need a retina, an LGN, a V1. You need all the generic regions as well to get the information into the FFA and to read information out.
Okay, there is another question by Devanshu Nandi, and he asks, so is face selectivity completely innate, or there is some cognitive development that occurs as one ages?
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. So we scanned infants down to, I think the youngest infants were 2 or 3 months old. We don't have enough data to analyze them alone. So we grouped the whole 2 to 10-month-old set together. It would be lovely to know if that face selective response that I showed you is present in newborns as soon as they pop out. That would be great. That is an extremely hard study to do. So I think we don't know. We do know that behaviorally, newborn infants within 10 minutes of birth prefer to look at faces than non-faces, right? We also know that newborns that are just a few days old can discriminate faces of different identities, can do it better when they're upright than inverted, and show various other adult-like properties of face recognition. So we know that many properties of the face system are present very early. But it's tricky to know whether even the little bit of experience that those infants have would be enough to wire it up. That is, however, something we can now approach with computational modeling by varying the amount of training data and asking, can you, in principle, develop a system that does this based on that amount of training data?
There's another question. Could you share, this is Madhavi Rangaswamy, and she's asking if you could share your thoughts about face processing and the sense of self.
Well, I can share them because I don't really have them. Look, I think there is, you know, a sense of self, but whether that's I don't know what it means exactly. I don't know exactly how to study it. I know there's a bunch of cognitive neuroscience work on the sense of self, and there's a claim that there are medial prefrontal regions that are more engaged when you make judgments about yourself than judgments about close others. I don't know what to make of that stuff, but my guess is that that's probably not that linked to faces, right? I mean, they're just, a sense of self feels like a totally different thing than the face system, which I think is really a bunch of visual perceptual features that, you know, tell you how one face looks differently from another. And that seems to me pretty remote from a sense of self, but I have no idea.
We have another question by Krishnendu Bose, and he's asking, have you done any studies where you factored in context in which the faces are processed into the CNN?
Well, let me think about that. I don't think it's factored in, but kind of nothing is really factored in. It's just a matter of what's in your training diet, what's in the images that you feed in, and what's in the task you give them. So the stimuli that we've trained networks on are very heterogeneous, right? Things from ImageNet with, you know, all kinds of different images. So they certainly get lots of context information, but we haven't asked networks to decode, to give information about context and faces. So it could absolutely be done, but that's not something we've done before. Oh, but I'll say something else. And Ratan, if you're still there, you might have another perspective on this. But one thing I will say is that the networks are just exploiting all of the information they have. You know, an object recognition trained CNN doesn't kind of say, okay, like here's an image, let's find the most prominent thing in it, let's model its shape, let's do all this stuff. It just takes whatever it can get. And so if there's a built-in context confound in the image, it will use that, right? And so one way to see that is we were looking in an image data set for, how did this go? We were looking for, Ratan, are you there?
Yeah, I was saying we're looking for fish, right? The fish.
Yeah. Remind me how that went. We were, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are all these like covariance statistics even in the stimulus databases, right? So one prominent example is if you look at the category of fish, right, and that will almost always have a human carrying the fish in front of them like this. So there's always a face and a fish in the scene because they have been taken from Instagram pictures and pictures that have been publicly uploaded on the internet, which almost always have people posing with the animal, right, as catch. So somehow, I mean, so the hope is that if you have another category called faces, that in the process of having several million images, you impose significant constraints that you sort of factor out the contribution of the faces, but that does not always happen. And there's all these problems that are happening in the artificial intelligence community because of all the algorithms becoming racist, for instance, because for the same reason. So it's very, very important to make sure that that biases, we keep track of all the biases that might be sort of creeping into the construction of the stimulus databases as well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think
that's the closest to context. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main point is the network doesn't know the difference between the thing you're training it on and the context of that thing. It's just all information to exploit, and it will use whatever it can.
There's another question, and it's, have you considered carrying out similar studies in animals and congenitally blind animals such as blind mole rats?
So absolutely. And in my view, when we manage to answer a little bit of a question in humans, it's cause for celebration because our methods are so much weaker than methods that are available for studying animals. So I study humans because I'm interested in humans, but I'm like wistful and jealous all the time of my colleagues who have just spectacular abilities to measure, to see a whole neural code, to watch it change over time with single cell resolution and millisecond resolution, and to have causal tests and to control experience, all these things that we can't really do very well in humans. So yes, there are many, many studies in animals, and many of them are highly informative. So I, for the sake of brevity, left out a lot of the background with the blind study, but it's very interesting because a study was published a few years ago by Michael Arcaro and Marge Livingstone, and they raised baby monkeys without ever allowing them to see faces. Okay, so normal adult monkeys have a whole face system with multiple face selective patches, much like we see in humans. That's fabulous because you can study those face patches in monkeys, and they have been studied in great detail, revealing many things about the neural code. It's really beautiful, beautiful work. But you also have the ability to control experience. And so Arcaro and Livingstone raised these baby monkeys without ever letting them see faces. And then when they get to be, adolescent monkeys, they pop them in the scanner, show them faces for the first time, and ask if they have face selective cortex. And they don't. And so Arcaro and Livingstone concluded from this, the title of their paper was something like visual experience with faces is necessary for the formation of face selective cortex. Well, that conclusion was wrong, as Ratan's study showed. But they were onto something. Certainly what they showed is that monkeys without visual experience don't show selective visual responses to faces once they're first shown those faces. So that's a really fascinating, important constraint that I think is really informative. It sounds at first inconsistent with Rattan's data, but it's not actually, not just because it's monkeys rather than humans. But I think actually probably the key difference is that those baby monkeys, those adolescent monkeys, when they were first shown novel visual pattern they've never seen before. Whereas the humans in Rattan's study knew instantly when they felt that thing, that's a face. And so that may really matter for the response that we get. Anyway, so there's, bottom line, there's loads of relevant, interesting, powerful work in animals that's essential for making progress in understanding humans, because they can do experiments that we can't in humans.
Another question is by Shubhankar Shah. He asks, the trained CNN models are product of supervised learning algorithms, whereas infants do not always receive feedback in the early age. The CNN models you showed to have successfully predicted face responses in adults, do they also well predict the children fMRI data?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, the CNN models that we're using are not models of development, right? They're models of the adult state. And nobody thinks that the way a CNN is trained with millions of labeled training examples is anything like the way an infant brain develops its visual abilities. Okay, so first point is they're not models of development. Now that said, there are some exciting developments in computational neural networks that are getting a little closer. They're still not very close, but they're closer in interesting ways. And so there was a paper that came out a few months ago, I think just on the bioRxiv, I can't remember if it's published, from Dan Yemens and Mike Frank and Jim DiCarlo and others, where they use unsupervised or self-supervised training. And so this differs from the standard network where you give it millions of labeled training examples and you keep adjusting the weights based on how wrong it is. In this case, you don't give it labeled examples, you just show it lots and lots of stimuli. And it basically tries to cluster the input. It tries to come up with a representational space where you get nice clusters from that input. And amazingly, those models work essentially as well at object recognition as the ones trained on millions of labeled examples. And further, that raises the possibility that we might be able to use those models to model development. So the people who did that work have this SACAM database, which is a set of videos collected from head-mounted cameras in infants. And so you can take actual infant visual input and train up self-supervised models to see how well they can do. And so that's starting to get closer to asking which of these models might capture the development in a way that's a little more similar to what happens in infant brains. And I think that's a super exciting development.
I think Suraj Kumar has a question. Suraj, you can unmute and ask what your question is.
Hi, Professor, my question is, what about semantically relevant versus non-relevant faces? For example, familiar versus novel or task relevant versus non-relevant? Is there something like a face comprehension system or so?
I didn't quite hear, but okay, you're saying a face comprehension system. You mean like knowing the identity of those individuals and all the other knowledge you have about them? Is that the question?
Yes, like the processing from the features to decision system, let's say.
Features to the what system? Semantic
decision system, deciding and then knowing that, okay, this person I know, recognize, this person I don't actually.
Oh, a decision system. Okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, so if the judgment is just familiar, unfamiliar, I don't know of a network that's been trained on that, but I certainly see no reason why you couldn't. You could take the VGG database system, hold out some stimuli for testing, train it on the other ones, and then get it to discriminate new images of old faces versus new images of new faces. And I bet it could do that. And then you would basically train up a decision stage to do that. And I'd be shocked if that didn't work. None of the models I know of do that, but one could certainly do that.
Okay, thanks.
So I think that's that with the
I
questions.
think, I think we are all tired, and questions will continue.
It's late for you guys. It's late for you guys.
I can tell that if anybody has, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of questions, please write an email to Nancy, and she will be very happy to write you back.
Absolutely.
And a lot of these questions were diverse at the same time, were interesting in their many ways. And I think we should stop. And I again thank Nancy for having taken the time and giving us the opportunity to talk to her and to share her views. And I also thank all the audience who have been with us since we started this program. And we will continue with this series with many legendary, important researchers. And probably our next speaker is Mike Posner. As many of you know, Mike's work has contributed, or rather changed or created the field of attention in some ways. So we're talking to him and some other people. And please have a look at the website. If you subscribe, you will get the information how to join us. And I think that was a nice evening here. It's late evening in India, and in Boston it's morning. And we all hope together that we will come out of this in some time. And we don't have to do the study on the infants. We were born in March, and how there are some of the things develop deviantly. I hope that we are out of this. And I hope that in November, Nancy gets a surprise with regard to the big question.
Me too.
Next 4 years of America. And us in turn, because we live in reflections all the time. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
And good night.
Very enjoyable. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.